All right, hello everybody. Welcome to our next lesson here. Response to racism. This is for our unit Urban America. Okay, objectives and standards. You will be able to identify how African Americans resisted segregation, and you will be able to describe different views on the African American response to racism. And take a moment there to look at the standards here that I'm circling here for you now. Sorry about my crazy circle there. All right, desired result. What were the views of African American leaders to segregation? What were the views of African American leaders to segregation? Vocabulary, just one vocab word here. Lynch. Lynch is to execute by hanging without lawful approval. Okay, we're going to go into that a little bit more here in the lesson. It'll hopefully make a little more sense here as we go on here through the lesson. So, speaking of lynching, the fight against lynching. Mob violence increased in the late 1800s in the United States, especially in the South. And an average of 154 people were lynched each year between 1890 and 1899. So what this means is a lot of whites were taking African Americans out of their homes in the middle of the night, or if African Americans didn't follow certain laws about segregation, or did something that whites didn't approve of, they would simply rough up an African American man or woman or child and hang them in a tree without ever them having a trial or going to court or being arrested or anything like that. Okay, and this is obviously illegal, but this is what was happening in the South. So in 1892, Ida B. Wells, a young African American woman from Tennessee, started a campaign against lynching. She was actually driven out of town and decided to settle, and then settled in Chicago, Illinois instead. 1895, Ida B. Wells published a book that demanded a fair trial and honest conviction for those accused of a crime. Again, trying to get rid of lynchings and things like that. Now, while Congress rejected an anti-lynching bill, the amount of lynchings decreased in 1900 due to the work of Ida B. Wells, because many more people became aware of what was happening in the South, and even in the North sometimes too, sadly, with lynching. So we do begin to see a decrease in lynchings, although it's not going to stop. But Ida B. Wells had a very big role in that. So rights and equality. A college-educated woman, Mary Church Terrell, in the top left-hand corner here, I'll highlight her for you here. She took up the fight against lynchings. Put an S there. Racism and sexism. She worked with women suffrage leaders such as Jane Addams, top right-hand corner here, and Susan B. Anthony, who you might recognize her name, very important in trying to gain the right for women to vote. So she worked with both of these women. And Mary Church Terrell also helped form the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, which is still around today and fights for equal rights and equality for African Americans. She also formed the Women Wage Earners Association that assisted African American waitresses, nurses, and domestic workers. And a boycott against department stores in Washington, D.C. that refused to serve African Americans was also led by Terrell. So she also played a very pivotal role in trying to help African Americans and fight back against segregation and racism, as well as sexism as well. Now, a call for compromise. Booker T. Washington, on the left-hand side here for you, kind of talked a little bit about him already, but he was a famous African-American leader during the late 1800s. Sorry about the check mark there. He had established the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute to help train and educate, African-Americans. Here's a picture here of some African-American students at Tuskegee Institute. So Washington proposed that African Americans should focus more on economic goals than political rights. Okay, so what he's basically saying here is that put aside the fight for equality and let's try to build ourselves up economically to gain more rights. In 1895, Booker T. Washington gave a speech known as the Atlanta Compromise. Okay, and he believed that He believed that if African Americans could earn the respect of whites through hard work, political equality would follow. Now, you can agree or disagree with this. Some people say this was the right approach to this. Other people, as we're going to talk about here in a little bit here, say that it was not the right approach. But Booker T. Washington believed that if African Americans could get a job, get an education, they would gain the respect and approval of whites that way to gain more political rights. Again, you can agree or disagree with that. Washington urged African Americans to postpone for the fight for civil rights. I should say postpone the fight for civil rights and focus on education and training instead. Sorry about that typo there. So rejection and resistance. A leader of a new generation of African American activists was this guy right here, W.E.B. Du Bois, or W.B. Du Bois. Most people say Du Bois, who disagreed with Booker T. Washington's views. Du Bois challenged Washington's views and explained why in his 1903 book, The Soul of Black Folk. He argued there is no advantage to giving up the fight for civil rights, and Du Bois was especially concerned with protecting and exercising the right to vote. He urged African Americans to continue to fight to end discrimination. Now, unfortunately, like I said in our last lesson, this is not going to truly happen for African Americans for at least another 50, 60 years when we get to the civil rights era in the 1960s. But you can see that African American leaders and others are taking up the fight against racism and segregation and discrimination in many different ways. All right, so closure. What were the views of African American leaders to segregation? Think about Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell, Booker T. Washington, and W.B. Du Bois, all these leaders and famous people, and others for that matter, that we didn't really talk about, such as ordinary people getting involved as well, fighting back against racism and segregation and discrimination. Think about their views and what they are proposing to make some changes, okay? And that'll help you answer your questions. I hope you have a great rest of your day or night. Try your best on the questions and let me know if you need any help or if you have any concerns, and I hope to talk to y'all soon. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.